During the 1980s, the countryside of West Germany was constantly buzzing with the sound of military aircraft. The Royal Air Force had, since the end of World War II, been in a constant state of readiness for a war with the Soviet Union. On the 25th of May 1982, two RAF Jaguar GR1 aircraft of 14 Squadron had been on a routine training mission and were recovering back to their base at RAF Bruggen. Whilst undergoing his pre-landing preparations, one of the two Jag pilots was startled to find his radar warning receiver light up. He'd been locked onto by an unknown aircraft. And just a few terrifying moments later, he was hanging from his parachute, having ejected from his disintegrating aircraft. As he landed in a farmer's field, he looked up to see his adversary make a low pass overhead. But it wasn't a Soviet Mig. It was an RAF F4 Phantom that had one less missile on board. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, several RAF units remained in Germany as part of the occupying forces, and by 1959 these units had been formalised into a Royal Air Force command. This command was named Royal Air Force Germany and was operating out of four main flying stations: RAF Gütersloh, RAF Laarbruch, RAF Wildenrath and RAF Bruggen. On the morning of Tuesday, May 25, 1982, two Seppicat Jaguar GR1 aircraft of No. 14 Squadron had departed RAF Bruggen for a routine training mission. The lead aircraft was flown by Flight Lieutenant Paddy Mullen, and his number 2 in Jaguar X-Ray 963 was Flight Lieutenant Steve Griggs. Griggs was a last-minute call-up to the sortie, as the original pilot took ill that morning, and Griggs was only too pleased to swap his desk for a Jaguar that morning. The Jaguar was an Anglo-French single-seat attack aircraft, and served with the RAF from 1973 up until 2007. They had been serving in RAF Germany since the mid-1970s and formed an integral part of the NATO air defence. The Jaguar II ship had been carrying out a forward air controller training sortie, and it had been a very successful flight over the North German plain. But it was during the recovery to RAF Bruggen that things would turn disastrously wrong. Only a few hours earlier, at RAF Wildenrath, the morning had not begun as straightforward and routine as it had for 14 Squadron at Bruggen. Normal alarm clocks had been replaced with a station siren, as a full station exercise had been called. These regular exercises were designed to simulate an unexpected advance by Soviet forces, and the station must move from a peacetime role to a full war footing as fast as possible. All personnel, whether in barracks, on-camp married quarters or living off-camp, must report to their place of work immediately. At 92 Squadron, things were at a frantic pace. The air crews were hurriedly kitted up and ushered through their briefings, whilst at the same time, the squadron armourers were busying themselves with arming up of the F4 Phantom FGR2 aircraft. Each aircraft was to be armed with 4 short-range AIM-9G Sidewinder air-to-air missiles, as well as 4 medium-range Skyflash radar-guided missiles. The Phantom FGR2 had been acquired by the RAF in 1968 to fill the roles of long-range strike, close air support and reconnaissance, and, like the Jaguar, formed the backbone of the RAF's presence in West Germany since the mid-1970s. The objective for the exercise is to have 70% of the available aircraft on state as fast as possible. Once this is achieved, the aircraft would be de-armed and a typical training load fitted. This consisted of an inert training Sidewinder that had a fully active seeker head, although no warhead and no rocket motor. The 4 Skyflash missiles were replaced with a dummy plug, which in effect fooled the missile management system into thinking that it had weapons on each station. The air crews would then stand by their aircraft along with their ground crews and await a practice scramble. At the height of the Cold War in West Germany, it was common to engage other friendly aircraft in mock attacks. It was standard practice, and targets of opportunity often resulted in full-on dogfight situations. It made for very realistic situations that was ideal training for potential Soviet encounters. Arriving late to the exercise was Phantom pilot Flight Lieutenant Roy Lawrence and his navigator Flight Lieutenant Alistair Inverarity. As they had missed the start of the exercise, they were rushed through a briefing and quickly dispatched to an aircraft. To add to realism, incidents are injected into the situation, and as part of the exercise, a simulated bomb incident on their hardened aircraft shelter meant they had to evacuate, and they were reallocated another Phantom, X-Ray Victor 422. This aircraft had previously been allocated as one of the 3 Quick Reaction Alert jets, and was fully armed. Quick Reaction Alert, or QRA, consisted of 3 permanently armed aircraft, 2 on state and 1 as a spare, ready to scramble at a moment's notice in response to real-world incidents. At 12:40, the scramble came. Lawrence and Inverarity very quickly got their fully armed Phantom off the runway and climbed out. With the exception of QRA, it was most unusual to scramble a fully armed aircraft on exercise, but the crew was aware and confident of the fail-safes in place to prevent accidental release of weapons. When the Phantom was approximately 35 miles northeast of RAF Bruggen and initiating its combat air patrol, Inverarity in the back seat picked up a couple of targets on his radar. He quickly identified the target as a pair of Jaguar GR1s, and he reported this back to the fighter controller, who, in turn, instructed them to engage the hostile targets. The pair of Jaguars on Inverarity's scope were the 14 Squadron Jaguars being flown by Paddy Mullen and Steve Griggs. As per standard procedure, they had just climbed to an altitude of 1,350 feet, which is a set height for recovery back to base, to avoid outbound traffic, which would be on a set altitude of 750 feet. Griggs was continuing with his recovery procedures when he noticed his radar warning receiver light up to indicate a radar lock on his aircraft. To assist with aircraft separation, it was common practice for the Phantoms of Wildenrath to paint their targets with their radar, and Griggs' first instinct was that this was probably the case. As he and Mullen were in the late stages of recovery, as well as low on fuel, they were not too inclined to engage in combat manoeuvres, and so stayed on their heading and altitude, assuming that the engaging aircraft would complete his mock attack run and leave the area. In the Phantom, Lawrence began going through a procedure that he had carried out many times before on an aircraft fitted with a training loadout. In the back seat, Inverarity was too occupied with his various procedures that he hadn't noticed that Lawrence had moved the master arming switch to live. The aircraft was now in an ideal firing position, and Lawrence was receiving a growl in his headset indicating that a Sidewinder seeker head had acquired the target. Thinking that his inert training Sidewinder was giving him a good lock, he squeezed the trigger. The only lasting indication of a successful firing should have been a witness mark on the radar film. But instead, Lawrence could only watch in horror as a streak shot out in front of his cockpit towards the helpless Jaguar. The Sidewinder is a fire and forget missile, and there was nothing that now could be done to prevent the inevitable. In Griggs' Jaguar, relative calm exploded in an instant with a violent yaw to the right. His canopy shattered and he found his aircraft to be in a flat spin. Unbeknown to him, the missile had struck his aft section just behind the right wing and blown his aircraft in two, the forward section, with him still in it, spinning away. Despite the terrific noise, Griggs could still hear his wingman Mullen yelling, "Eject, eject, eject." Griggs was in no mood to question this advice, and he pulled the black and yellow handle. He recalled later that immediately following pulling the handle, a violent explosion forced his head down into his chest and a vision of the cockpit dropping away beneath him, and then silence, hanging under his deployed parachute, with the German countryside rushing up to meet him. He landed very roughly in a farmer's field, in pain but alive, and he was relieved to see two people running over to him, who turned out to be a farmer and his daughter. As they approached, he looked up and saw a lone Phantom fly over, but he was still oblivious to what had just happened. A short time later, but not before the farmer had supplied a good deal of brandy, a Luftwaffe search and rescue helicopter arrived to pick Griggs up and take him back to RAF Bruggen. Even after arriving back at base, and then travelling to hospital for x-rays, and then back at the bar at Bruggen for several beers, did he actually discover what had happened. That lone Phantom he saw over the farmer's field had shot him down. Considering all of the safety guards in place for flying an armed aircraft, how could this have happened? There is a saying that disasters don't just happen, They are a result of a series of minor incidents, which, if any of those minor incidents hadn't happened, disaster would be averted. This was very much the case. First, the crew were late for the exercise and had to have a very hurried briefing, and of the few unallocated aircraft remaining, they were given a QRA jet, fully armed. Then the exercise bomb incident saw them reallocated to another aircraft, also a Q jet, that was fully armed. Because the aircraft was armed, the squadron armourers should have placed some red tape over the master armament switch, as a visual reminder to the pilot that the aircraft is carrying live weapons. This was found to be missing. Another failsafe is in the rear cockpit. The circuit breaker for the armament control systems is required to be pulled prior to flight, rendering the system inoperable. Flight Lieutenant Inverarity stressed that this had indeed been done, but further inspection revealed that this CB was faulty and required very little pressure for it to regain contact, something that high G loads, for example, could easily achieve. And finally, the fighter controller should have issued a directive immediately prior to authorising the engagement to check switches safe. This directive was not issued. Flight Lieutenant Lawrence and Flight Lieutenant Inverarity both subsequently faced a court-martial and were found to be guilty of negligence, resulting in a severe reprimand. This was, however, the least severe punishment that could have been handed down, and it would seem that the court recognised that wider system failings were also responsible for the accident. Many changes in procedures will follow as a result. Lawrence and Inverarity were returned to flying duty, and following recuperation, Steve Griggs also found himself back in a Jaguar. However, just a few months later, he would again owe his life to Martin Baker, when his aircraft suffered a serious fire on a training flight out of RAF Lossiemouth in Scotland, causing him to eject on the 10th of September 1982. As is fitting with Royal Air Force traditions and sense of humour, much beer was drank, and Griggs holds no hard feelings towards the Phantom crew, in fact inviting them to share a barrel of beer in the mess, which they accepted. The Jaguar shootdown has gone down in 92 Squadron folklore and was illustrated with the addition of a kill symbol on the port air intake of X-Ray Victor 422, confirming its reputation as a Jag killer. The squadron even recovered the nose wheel door of the Jaguar, which, decades later, still hangs proudly in the 92 Squadron crew room. Well, as the saying goes, a kill is a kill. Thanks very much for watching. Please hit the like button and consider subscribing.